I built a garden gnome that sent our HOA president straight to the emergency room, and honestly, I'm not even sorry about what happened to her face. They thought someone had been shot, but it wasn't a bullet. It was karma served in a red ceramic hat. You want to know what I put inside that gnome? Stay tuned, because this is how you break a tyrant. It was 6:30 a.m. on a Tuesday. The mist was still clinging to the manicured lawns of Oak Creek Estates, a neighborhood where the grass is always green, but the souls are often black. I stood on my porch, staring at the carnage. Gnome number 23 lay in pieces. His ceramic head was crushed into a fine white powder, his cheerful red hat split down the middle like a discarded shell. Beside him, his tiny fishing pole was snapped in half. This wasn't an accident. This was a message. And there, 3 feet away, lay the calling card, a single pink garden glove. Cassandra Mitchell, our HOA president and self-appointed queen of the suburbs, wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. She had destroyed 23 of my decorations in 6 months. She laughed every time she did it. I looked at the house next door. My neighbor Marcus was peeking through his blinds. He saw it. He always saw it. But like everyone else on this street, he was paralyzed by fear. Cassandra didn't just run the HOA, she owned the neighborhood. She was the destroyer of joy, a serial gnome murderer in designer athleisure. But as I picked up the jagged shards of Gnome 23, the familiar rage in my chest felt different, cold, calculated. I wasn't going to call the police this time. I wasn't going to file a complaint that she would just toss into her gold-plated trash can. This time I was going to build something special. I heard her then, that shrill, condescending voice that sounds like glass grinding on metal. I turned to see her power walking past my driveway, her blonde hair pulled back so tight it looked like a surgical facelift. She stopped, checked her expensive smartwatch, and offered me a smirk that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh my," she said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "Another accident? You really should secure those tacky little things better, Jackson. They seem so fragile." She didn't even break her stride. She just kept walking, confident in her absolute immunity. She had no idea that she had just signed a contract with the devil. To understand why I did what I did, you have to understand Cassandra Mitchell. She had been the HOA president for 4 years, and in that time, she'd turned Oak Creek into her personal feudal kingdom. We're talking about a woman who issued violation notices if your grass was a 1/4 inch too tall. She fined families if their Christmas lights stayed up until January 3rd. She once tried to ban a veterans therapy dog because it disrupted the aesthetic continuity of the streetscape. She lived in the biggest house on the block, a modern monstrosity of glass and steel that looked like a high-end refrigerator. Her husband, Julian, was a high-powered corporate lawyer who was always away on business. We all knew the truth. Julian wasn't traveling for work. He was running for his life from his nightmare of a wife. The Great Gnome War started 6 months ago. I had won the Neighborhood Garden of the Year award, beating out Cassandra's precious $1,000 rose bushes. The judges loved my whimsical fairy tale display, 25 gnomes strategically placed among the hydrangeas. The moment they announced my name, Cassandra's face looked like she'd bitten into a lemon wrapped in barbed wire. The very next morning, 3 of my gnomes were found smashed on the pavement. I checked my security cameras. There she was at 2:00 a.m., dressed in all black like a suburban ninja, swinging a heavy wooden cricket bat. She looked directly into the lens, smiled, and delivered the final blow to Fishing Fred. When I took the footage to the police, they gave me the same tired line. "It's a civil matter, Mr. Miller. Take it up with your HOA." I went to the board meeting. I showed the video. The 4 other board members sat there like trained seals, nodding as Cassandra examined her nails. She looked up and said, "I have no recollection of this. Furthermore, Section 7.3 states no lawn decorations may exceed 12 inches. My gnomes were 13 inches. I realized then that I was completely alone. No law, no rule, and no authority was going to save me. If I wanted justice, I had to manufacture it myself. Most people would have given up. My wife Alina kept telling me to let it go. "They're just ceramic, Jackson," she'd say, but she didn't get it. This wasn't about gnomes anymore. This was about the principle of the thing. This was about not letting an entitled tyrant dictate what I could do on the land I paid for. I started buying more, bigger gnomes, 14 inches tall just to spit in the face of her rules. I arranged them like a little infantry unit. And Cassandra, she escalated. She started smashing them in broad daylight. She'd walk past, grab one, and shatter it against the sidewalk while maintaining dead-eyed eye contact with me through my living room window. But then the universe gave me a gift. I was at the local hardware store, browsing the garden section for replacements, when I overheard two women gossiping in the next aisle. "Did you hear about Cassandra Mitchell's restraining orders?" one asked. My ears perked up. "Which one?" the other laughed. "She's got at least 3. The woman is clinically insane." I moved closer, pretending to study a bag of fertilizer. They talked about her history, how she'd been forced to resign from 2 previous HOAs after incidents. In her last neighborhood, she'd been caught on camera poisoning a neighbor's award-winning flowers. Her lawyer husband had made it all go away with non-disclosure agreements and heavy settlements. My mind was racing. Cassandra wasn't just a mean neighbor. She was a serial community terrorizer. She moved from suburb to suburb, seized power, made everyone's life a living hell, and then moved on once the legal heat got too high. We were just her latest prey. That night I sat in my garage, surrounded by 23 ceramic corpses. I looked at the broken pieces of my little friends, and I made a choice. Julian Mitchell might be a lawyer who could make problems disappear, but I was an engineer, and I was about to build a problem that wouldn't go away. I spent the next 3 weeks in my workshop, planning, designing, testing. I was building the Final Gnome, and it was going to be unforgettable. The Final Gnome started as a standard 15-inch garden decoration. I chose one with a cheerful blue coat and a bright red hat. To the naked eye, he looked like a masterpiece of lawn art. But inside, he was hollowed out, replaced with a masterpiece of mechanical retribution. I remembered that pink cricket bat Cassandra loved so much. I figured if she enjoyed swinging things so much, she'd enjoy the law of physics even more. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. I installed a pressure-sensitive trigger in the base, connected to a high-tension, spring-loaded mechanism. I reinforced the gnome's fishing pole with a solid steel rod, disguised it with expanding foam, and painted it to look like wood. When a certain amount of force was applied to the gnome, specifically the force of a swinging bat, the trigger would release. That steel-reinforced pole would shoot upward at the speed of a professional boxer's jab. I tested it 17 times in the garage on a heavy boxing dummy. Snap crack. Every single time, the rod shot up and caught the dummy right in the chin. The dummy's head would snap back with a sickening thud. It was a level of satisfaction I hadn't felt in years. I placed him in the front of my garden display, right where the morning sun would catch his glossy finish. He was irresistible, a 15-inch violation of everything Cassandra stood for. That night I didn't sleep. I watched the Ring camera on my phone. I felt a twinge of guilt. Was I becoming as bad as her? But then I thought of the 23 broken gnomes. I thought of the therapy dog she tried to take away. I thought of the fear in Marcus's eyes. The guilt vanished. 6:15 a.m., the camera chirped. There she was. She was wearing a neon pink tracksuit that was an assault on the eyes. She slowed down as she reached my house. She saw the new recruit. She stopped dead. I was behind my curtains, holding my breath, recording the whole thing on a second handheld camera. Cassandra looked around. The street was empty. She reached into her designer fanny pack and pulled out the pink cricket bat. She stood over the gnome like an executioner. This was it, the moment of truth. Cassandra raised the bat high over her head. She was smiling, that cruel, privileged smile of someone who has never known a consequence in her life. She swung hard. She wanted this one to turn to dust. The bat connected with the gnome's head, For a microsecond, there was the sound of ceramic cracking. But then, clang, the trigger tripped, the spring released. The steel-reinforced fishing pole shot upward like a lightning bolt. It caught Cassandra directly under the jaw with a sound like a hammer hitting a stake. Her head snapped back so violently her headband flew into the street. The pink bat went flying, skittering across the concrete. Cassandra stumbled back, her hands flying to her face, letting out a sound, a horrible, wet, gurgling scream that didn't sound human. She collapsed onto my lawn, rolling in the grass, blood starting to seep through her manicured fingers. I stood there frozen. Part of my brain was screaming, "Jackson, you're going to jail." But another part, the part that had watched 23 gnomes die, felt a cold, stony peace. Marcus, my neighbor, came running out of his house. He must have heard the impact. He saw Cassandra on the ground and immediately dialed 911. I had 5 minutes. I looked at the ring camera. The final gnome was still standing. He had a small crack in his head, but the mechanism had already retracted. To any observer, he was just an innocent piece of pottery. Sirens began to wail in the distance. Neighbors started pouring out of their houses, Mrs. Kim from across the street, the Henderson family from down the block. A crowd was gathering around the fallen queen. As the ambulance pulled up, Cassandra pointed a bloody finger at my front door. "He trapped it," she shrieked through a broken jaw. "He built a trap, arrest him." The paramedics were trying to stabilize her, whispering about jaw fractures and facial lacerations. I felt a sinking feeling in my gut. This wasn't a prank anymore. This was a felony. Officer Ramirez walked up to my door. He looked at me, then at the bloody woman on the stretcher. "Mr. Miller," he said gravely, "your neighbor is claiming you assaulted her with a booby-trap decoration. What do you have to say?" I opened my mouth to speak, but my throat was dry. This was the end. Until Marcus stepped forward. Marcus, the man who had been a ghost for 3 years, walked right up to the officer. "I saw everything," Marcus said, his voice surprisingly firm. "Cassandra Mitchell has been trespassing on this property and destroying this man's belongings for months. I have the videos, dozens of them." My jaw dropped. "And it's not just him," Marcus continued. "I'm a private investigator, officer. I've been building a file on Mrs. Mitchell since she moved in. I recognized her from a case in Riverside 2 years ago. Same pattern, same harassment." The officer's eyes widened. He turned his attention away from me and toward Marcus's cracked iPhone. "Start with the folder marked July," Marcus said. As the officer scrolled through the videos, his face shifted from suspicion to pure disgust. He watched Cassandra swinging her bat, watched her laughing as she smashed property, watched her trespassing in the middle of the night. Cassandra was being loaded into the ambulance, screaming about her rights and her lawyer husband. Officer Ramirez walked over to the vehicle. "Ma'am," he said, loud enough for the whole street to hear, "I'm going to need you to remain at the hospital for a statement. We're opening a criminal investigation into felony property destruction and harassment." The silence that followed was broken by Mrs. Kim. "Officer, I have videos too. She towed my grandson's car for no reason." "She tried to fine us for our religious statues," shouted the Hendersons. It was like a dam had burst. Every neighbor Cassandra had bullied, every person she had silenced was now stepping forward. The fear was gone. In its place was a collective, burning justice. The officer turned back to me. "About that gnome, Mr. Miller, I'm going to have to take it as evidence." He picked it up carefully. I held my breath, praying the spring wouldn't trip and break a cop's hand. It didn't. He put it in the trunk of his squad car and drove away. As the sirens faded, the neighbors didn't go back inside. They surrounded me. They were laughing, sharing stories, finally breathing. I looked at Marcus. "Why didn't you tell me? Why let me go through this alone?" Marcus smiled. "I needed her to escalate, Jackson. I needed undeniable proof of a pattern for the courts. I didn't expect you to build a revenge gnome, but honestly, that was a beautiful bonus." Part 7, The Lawyer's Deal. By noon, my wife Alina was home. I explained everything, the trap, the broken jaw, the pie next door. She sat on the couch for a long time, staring at me. "Jackson," she finally said, "you're lucky I'm a paralegal. We're going to need every loophole in the book." But then at 3:00 p.m. my phone rang, an unknown number. "Mr. Miller, this is Julian Mitchell, Cassandra's husband." My heart hammered against my ribs. Here it was, the high-powered lawyer coming to finish me off. "I'm not calling to threaten you," Julian said. He sounded exhausted. "I'm calling to offer a deal." He told me Cassandra was in surgery. A fractured jaw, 3 missing teeth, and permanent scarring. She wanted blood. She wanted me in prison. "But I'm tired, Jackson," Julian whispered. "I've been cleaning up her messes for 15 years. The settlements, the moving, the lies. I'm at the end of my rope." The deal was simple. Julian would use his influence to make the police investigation into the Gnome disappear. He would ensure no charges were filed against me. In exchange, the neighbors had to drop their charges against Cassandra. No lawsuits, no criminal complaints. "We will move out within 30 days, Julian promised. "We'll disappear, everyone wins." I told him I'd talk to the neighbors. I called Marcus. "Don't do it," Marcus said immediately. "If you let her walk, she just does this to another family in another town. She never learns because she never pays. I'm pressing charges regardless. I've got her for more than just gnomes, Jackson." "What do you mean?" I asked. "I did a deep dive into the HOA records," Marcus said. "Cassandra hasn't just been breaking gnomes. She's been embezzling, small amounts over 4 years. It adds up to $30,000. This isn't just a neighborhood spat anymore. This is a felony." I realized then that if I took the deal, I was helping a criminal escape. I'd be letting the bully win one last time. The next morning, I called Julian Mitchell back. "No deal," I said. "I'm not stopping the neighbors, and if the police want to charge me for the gnome, I'll see them in court. But your wife is finished." There was a long silence. Then Julian spoke. "For what it's worth, I'm glad someone finally stood up to her. Good luck, Mr. Miller." The fallout was spectacular. The police didn't charge me. The DA ruled the gnome incident as provoked negligence, given the months of documented harassment and trespassing. But Cassandra, she wasn't so lucky. She was hit with felony embezzlement, dozens of counts of property destruction, and witness intimidation. The HOA board voted her out within 48 hours. Julian filed for divorce a week later. She had to pay restitution for every single gnome she destroyed. Every dollar she stole from our dues had to be paid back with interest. She was barred from ever serving on an HOA board in the state again. Today, Maple Street, Oak Creek, feels different. The kids are out on their bikes. People are talking over their fences. The monstrosity of glass and steel is for sale. I stood in my yard this morning, looking at the empty spot where the Final Gnome once stood. I realized that 6 months ago, I wanted to run away. I wanted to sell the house and flee from a bully. Instead, I stayed, I fought, and I won. Sometimes the only way to stop a tyrant is to give them exactly what they're looking for. Cassandra Mitchell wanted a fight. I just gave her one she'd never forget. To understand why I did what I did, you have to understand Cassandra Mitchell. She had been the HOA president for 4 years, and in those 48 months, she turned Oak Creek into her personal feudal kingdom. This wasn't just a neighborhood anymore. It was a psychological battlefield where the rules were written in blood and property tax. We're talking about a woman who issued violation notices if your grass was a 1/4 inch too tall. She would walk the sidewalks with a literal ruler in her hand, her shadow stretching across the pavement like a dark omen. She fined families if their Christmas lights stayed up until January 3rd. I remember one family, the Petersons, who were grieving a loss and forgot to take down a single wreath. Cassandra slapped a $50 a day fine on their door before the funeral flowers had even wilted. She once tried to ban a neighbor's therapy dog because she claimed it disrupted the aesthetic continuity of the streetscape. whatever the hell that was supposed to mean. To Cassandra, life wasn't about living. It was about the look. And if your life didn't fit her glossy magazine vision of suburbia, she would prune you out like a dead leaf. She lived in the biggest house on the block, a modern monstrosity of glass and steel that looked like a high-end refrigerator or a cube made for a giant. It sat there, completely out of place among the traditional colonials, a cold monument to her ego. But of course, the rules she enforced so strictly on us never seemed to apply to her. Her grass was sometimes long, her lights sometimes stayed up late, but who was going to find the queen? Her husband, Julian, was a high-powered corporate lawyer who was always away on business. We all knew the truth. Julian wasn't traveling for work. He was running for his life from his nightmare of a wife, finding any excuse to stay in a hotel 3 states away rather than face her at the dinner table. The Great Gnome War, the conflict that would eventually end in blood and sirens, started exactly 6 months ago. It began because of a garden competition. I had spent all spring working on my yard, planting hydrangeas and creating a whimsical fairy tale scene with my secret weapon, 25 garden gnomes strategically placed among the flowers. The judges absolutely loved it. When they announced I had beaten Cassandra's precious $1,000 rose garden, I thought I had won a victory for the little guy. I'll never forget the look on her face when they handed me the plastic trophy. It was like watching someone bite into a lemon wrapped in barbed wire. Her eyes turned into cold slits of blue ice. She didn't clap. She didn't smile. She just turned and walked away. The very next morning, the massacre began. 3 of my gnomes were found smashed to pieces in my driveway, their ceramic bodies shattered like bone. I checked my Ring camera, and there she was. It was 2:00 a.m., and she was dressed in all black like some kind of suburban ninja, swinging a heavy wooden cricket bat with the precision of a professional. She looked directly into the camera lens before the final swing, smiled a predatory smile, and brought the bat down on Gardening Gary. I took that footage to the police, feeling like I had her cornered. You know what they said? "It's an HOA matter, Mr. Miller. Resolve it through your association." When I pointed out that the criminal was the HOA, the officer just shrugged and told me to file a civil complaint. I didn't give up. I went to the HOA board meeting. I showed the video to the 4 other board members. I waited for the gasps of horror for the immediate motion to remove her. Instead, there was silence. Cassandra sat at the head of the table, calmly examining her nails while the video played. When it was her turn to respond, she looked me dead in the eye and said, "I have no recollection of this event." Then she pulled out the community guidelines. "Furthermore," she said, her voice dripping with venom, "garden gnomes violate Section 7.3 regarding lawn ornamentation. No decorations exceeding 12 inches in height are permitted." My gnomes were 13 inches. The other board members just nodded along like trained seals, too terrified of her to speak the truth. I realized then that I was completely alone in this fight. Cassandra Mitchell had the neighborhood under her thumb through years of strategic intimidation and favor trading. There was no rule, no law, and no authority figure who was going to help me. So I did what any reasonable person would do. I went out and bought more gnomes, bigger ones, 14 inches tall, just to push the boundary. I arranged them in my garden like a little ceramic infantry unit, a silent army standing against a tyrant. And Cassandra, she accepted the challenge. She stopped hiding in the shadows and started destroying them in broad daylight. She would walk past my house during her morning power walk, grab a gnome, and smash it on the sidewalk while maintaining unblinking eye contact with me through my window. My wife Alina kept saying, "Just let it go. They're just gnomes." But she didn't understand. This wasn't about ceramic lawn decorations anymore. This was about principle. This was about not letting an entitled monster dictate what I could do with my own property. Each one of those little guys had a personality to me, fishing Fred, reading Rachel, gardening Gary, and she was murdering them one by one like a psychopath. But then things got really crazy. 2 months into the Gnome Wars, I discovered something that changed the entire game. I was at Home Depot, trying to decide between a set of mushroom-dwelling gnomes or the classic varieties, when I overheard a conversation that would lead me down a very dark path. Most people would have given up. Most people would have packed their bags, slapped a for sale sign on the lawn, and fled Oak Creek Estates with their tail between their legs. My wife Alina was practically begging me to do just that. "Jackson, they're just ceramic," she'd say, her voice tight with a mixture of worry and exhaustion. "It's not worth the stress. It's not worth the gray hair. Let her have her stupid victory." But Alina didn't see what I saw. She didn't see the predatory glint in Cassandra's eyes every time a gnome shattered. She didn't feel the cold, calculated weight of the injustice. This wasn't about decorations anymore. This was about the fact that in a supposedly free country, a woman in a pink tracksuit could walk onto my property and destroy my peace of mind because she felt like it. I needed an edge. I needed to know who I was really fighting. The breakthrough happened at the local hardware store, a massive, echoing warehouse of lumber and steel where I had become a frequent flyer in the garden section. I was browsing the clearance aisle, looking for anything heavy enough to withstand a hit, when I overheard two women gossiping near the fertilizer. They were wearing tennis skirts and holding expensive lattes, the universal uniform of the Oak Creek elite. "Did you hear about Cassandra Mitchell's restraining orders?" one whispered, leaning in close. My heart skipped a beat. I moved closer, pretending to intensely study the chemical composition of a bag of organic mulch. "Which one?" the other laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "She's got at least 3. The woman is clinically insane. Julian has spent more on NDAs and legal settlements than most people spend on their mortgages." They moved on, but the seed was planted. I went home and called an old friend from college, Marcus, who had left engineering to become a private investigator. I told him everything. I told him about the 23 gnomes, the cricket bat, and the HOA board that acted like a group of terrified hostages. "Jackson," Marcus said, his voice crackling over the line, "I'll look into her, but be careful. People like Cassandra don't just stop. They escalate until someone breaks." 3 days later, Marcus sent me a digital file that made my blood run cold. Cassandra wasn't just a mean neighbor. She was a serial community terrorizer. She had been forced to resign from 2 previous HOAs in 2 different states. In her last neighborhood in Connecticut, she'd been caught on camera poisoning a neighbor's award-winning prize hydrangeas with bleach because they were too flashy. Her husband, Julian, the high-powered lawyer, had made it all go away with massive payouts and ironclad non-disclosure agreements. She was a suburban predator who moved from town to town, seized power, and satisfied her deep-seated need for control by dismantling the lives of everyone around her. We were just her latest project. We were the prey, and she was the hunter. That night I didn't go to bed. I sat in my garage, the air smelling of oil and sawdust. I was surrounded by the corpses of 23 ceramic friends. I looked at the broken pieces of Fishing Fred, the very first gnome I'd bought when we moved in. His cheerful face was gone, replaced by a jagged hole. I felt a change in my chest. The anger wasn't hot and loud anymore. It was cold. It was precise. It was engineering. Julian Mitchell might be a lawyer who knew how to make legal problems disappear into a cloud of paperwork and cash, but I was a mechanical engineer who specialized in tension and release. I knew how things worked. I knew how to build a system that responded to force with equal, devastating force. I pulled out my old drafting table and a clean sheet of vellum. I didn't want to just stop her. I wanted to reveal her. I wanted the whole world to see the monster behind the pink tracksuit. I began to sketch. I calculated the arc of a cricket bat's swing. I measured the average height of a human jaw. I looked at the psi required to break ceramic versus the psi required to snap a high-tensile steel spring. "You want to play rough, Cassandra?" I whispered to the empty garage. "Let's play." I spent the next 3 weeks in total isolation. I told Alina I was working on a consulting project for a firm in the city. In reality, I was building the Trojan horse of garden gnomes. I called it Project Karma. It was going to be my masterpiece, and it was going to be the last thing Cassandra Mitchell ever saw coming. The transformation of my garage from a simple storage space into a laboratory of mechanical retribution was complete. Alina thought I was in here clearing out old boxes, but I was actually studying the physics of a strike. I had spent thousands of hours in my career designing safety mechanisms for heavy machinery, systems designed to stop a disaster. Now, I was designing a disaster specifically for one person. The Final Gnome started its life as a standard 15-inch garden decoration I found at a specialty shop 3 towns over. I needed something that looked innocent, something that blended into the whimsical aesthetic Cassandra hated so much. I chose a gnome with a cheerful blue coat, a snowy white beard, and a bright red hat. He was holding a long, slender fishing pole. To any passerby, he looked like he was just waiting for a bite in a pond that wasn't there. But inside, he was being hollowed out with the surgical precision of a watchmaker. I remembered the weapon Cassandra favored, that heavy, pink wooden cricket bat. I'd watched the footage from my Ring camera 100 times. I knew her stance. I knew the angle of her swing. She always aimed for the head. She wanted to see the brain of the gnome shatter. She drew a sick, twisted pleasure from the impact. "For every action," I whispered, the words of Newton haunting the dark corners of the garage, "there is an equal and opposite reaction." I began by reinforcing the base of the gnome with lead weights and industrial-strength epoxy. He needed to be heavy, heavy enough that when she hit him, he wouldn't just tip over. He needed to stand his ground. Then came the core, a high-tension, custom-ordered carbon steel spring that required a hydraulic press just to compress. I spent 4 nights perfecting the trigger. It had to be a Goldilocks mechanism. If it was too sensitive, a stray squirrel or a heavy gust of wind would set it off. If it was too stiff, her bat would just bounce off. It needed to trip exactly at the moment of peak impact. Next was the fishing pole. I removed the flimsy plastic rod and replaced it with a solid aircraft-grade titanium alloy core. I coated it in expanding foam, sanded it down, and painted it to look like weathered wood. To the naked eye, it was just a toy. In reality, it was a kinetic spear. I rigged the pole to the spring mechanism. When the top of the gnome's head, the hat, was struck with a force exceeding 40 pounds, the internal latch would slip. The spring would expand with the fury of a coiled rattlesnake, sending that titanium rod shooting upward and outward at a 45-degree angle. I tested it on a heavy-duty boxing dummy I'd borrowed from Marcus. I dressed the dummy in a pink tracksuit and positioned it exactly where Cassandra usually stood. I took a deep breath and swung a bat at the gnome's head. Crack snap. The sound was like a gunshot in the small garage. The rod shot up with such speed the human eye could barely track it. It caught the dummy right in the mandible area, the jaw. The impact sent the 100-pound dummy flying backward, its head snapping back with a sickening force. I stood there in the silence, the smell of burnt oil and ozone hanging in the air. My hands were shaking. This wasn't a toy. This was a weapon. For a split second, I thought about dismantling it. I thought about the hospital bills, the lawyers, the police. But then I looked at the corner of my workbench. There sat the shattered remains of Gnome 23, his little ceramic face staring up at me, broken and humiliated. I thought about the way Cassandra had laughed. I thought about the way she made the elderly Mrs. Kim cry over a flower bed. The guilt died a quick, cold death. I spent the final night applying the finishing touches. I painted the gnome with a high-gloss, weather-resistant sealant so he would gleam under the streetlights. He looked perfect. He looked like a masterpiece of suburban kitsch. I waited until 3:00 a.m., the hour of the wolf. I walked out onto my front lawn, the dew soaking through my socks. I placed him exactly 3 feet from the sidewalk, right in the center of her favorite strike zone. I leveled the base, checked the trigger one last time, and stepped back. In the moonlight, the gnome seemed to be smiling at me, a secret, knowing smile. "Good luck, little guy," I whispered. I went back inside, sat on the edge of my bed, and opened the live feed of my security cameras on my phone. The countdown had begun. The trap was set. Now all I needed was for the Queen of Oak Creek to come for her morning exercise. I didn't sleep. I sat in the darkness of my living room, the blue light of my phone screen illuminating my face like a ghost. I was watching the live feed of the front yard. The clock on the wall ticked, a slow, rhythmic countdown to a collision months in the making. 6:10 a.m. The streetlights flickered and died, leaving Oak Creek in that eerie gray pre-dawn light. 6:15 a.m. A movement on the edge of the frame. There she was, Cassandra Mitchell. She appeared at the edge of my property line, moving with that aggressive, rhythmic power walk that signaled her dominance over the neighborhood. She was wearing a neon pink tracksuit that seemed to glow in the twilight, a color that screamed for attention, a color that said I am the law. She slowed down as she approached my driveway. I saw her head turn. She spotted him. The Final Gnome sat there, his glossy blue coat catching the first hint of the sun, his titanium core fishing pole angled perfectly toward the sidewalk. I could see her chest heave as she let out a sharp, mocking laugh that I could almost hear through the glass. She didn't even look around this time. Her arrogance had become her blindfold. She reached into the deep pocket of her hoodie and pulled out the pink wooden cricket bat, the Gnome Slayer. I leaned forward, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard it felt like it would crack. "Do it," I whispered into the empty room. "Come on, Cassandra, take the bait." She stepped off the sidewalk and onto my grass, a clear act of trespassing she'd committed 23 times before. She gripped the bat with both hands, adjusting her stance like she was stepping up to the plate at Yankee Stadium. She took a practice swing, a cruel smile stretching across her face. She was savoring this. She wanted to feel the vibration of the ceramic shattering all the way up her arms. She drew the bat back, high over her right shoulder. She swung with everything she had. The impact was a sickening, metallic crack. The bat connected with the gnome's head, but it didn't shatter into dust like the others. Because of the lead weights and the epoxy, the gnome held its ground. The resistance was total. For a fraction of a second, the kinetic energy of her swing stopped dead, sending a jarring shockwave back through her wrists. And then the trigger tripped. Snap boom. The sound was like a pressurized steam pipe bursting. The internal high-tension spring released, and the titanium-reinforced fishing pole shot upward at a blistering velocity. It happened too fast for the human eye to track on a 30-frame-per-second camera. One moment, Cassandra was leaning into her swing. The next, her head was snapping back with a violent, whiplash force. The pole caught her squarely under the left side of her jaw, a perfect mechanical uppercut. The pink bat flew out of her hands, spinning through the air like a broken propeller before clattering onto the asphalt. Cassandra didn't even have time to scream. She went airborne for a split second before collapsing onto the mulch, her body folding like a discarded rag doll. I sat there frozen. On the screen, I saw her hands fly to her face. I saw the dark crimson start to stain the neon pink sleeves of her tracksuit. A low, guttural wail began to rise from the yard, a sound of pure, unadulterated shock. I checked the other camera feeds. The noise had been loud enough to wake the dead. Lights were flicking on in the houses across the street. Marcus's front door flew open. Mrs. Kim was peering out of her upstairs window, phone already in hand. "Oh God," I breathed, the reality of the mechanical violence sinking in. Cassandra was rolling on the ground now, kicking at the dirt, her cries turning into wet, bubbly shrieks. She tried to stand, but her balance was gone. She stumbled and fell back into my rose bushes, the thorns tearing at her expensive gear. I stayed in the shadows for a moment longer, watching the chaos unfold on my screen. This was what I wanted, wasn't it? This was the equal and opposite reaction. But as the first distant siren began to wail in the valley, a cold realization washed over me. The trap had worked perfectly, maybe too perfectly. I looked at the gnome. He was still standing, though his red hat was chipped and tilted to the side. He looked like a soldier who had survived the trenches. I stood up, wiped the sweat from my palms, and walked toward the front door. It was time to face the monster I had created. I stepped out onto the porch just as the first blue and red lights began to dance against the white siding of the houses. The air was crisp, but it felt heavy with the scent of ozone and the metallic tang of blood. Cassandra was still on the grass, a crumpled heap of neon-pink fabric. She wasn't screaming anymore. She was making a low, whistling sound through her teeth, a sound that told me her jaw was no longer a single piece of bone. The neighborhood was waking up in a way I'd never seen. Doors were clicking open. People who usually hid behind their curtains were stepping out into the light. Mrs. Kim stood on her lawn in a silk robe, her face a mask of shock. The Hendersons were by their mailbox, whispering. It was like the spell Cassandra had cast over Oak Creek had been broken by the sound of that spring releasing. Officer Ramirez was the first on the scene. He jumped out of his cruiser, his hand hovering near his belt, his eyes darting from the bleeding woman to me. "Nobody move," he barked. He knelt beside Cassandra, who let out a wet, garbled moan. She pointed a trembling, blood-slicked finger at me, then at the gnome. He did it," she wheezed. Each word looked like it cost her a gallon of agony. "A trap! He trapped the lawn." Ramirez looked at me, his brow furrowed. "Mr. Miller, what happened here? Did you assault this woman?" This was the moment where my life could end in a pair of handcuffs. My throat felt like it was filled with dry sand. I opened my mouth to explain, to tell him about the 23 gnomes, the harassment, the engineering, but a voice from the shadows cut me off. "She was trespassing, officer." We all turned. Marcus, my neighbor, was walking across the street. He wasn't in pajamas. He was dressed in a suit, holding a leather-bound folder and a tablet. He looked like he'd been waiting for this moment for years. "I saw the whole thing," Marcus said, his voice as steady as a surgeon's hand. "And more importantly, I recorded it, all of it." Ramirez stood up, wiping Cassandra's blood onto a sterile wipe. "You're a witness." "I'm more than that," Marcus replied, handing the tablet to the officer. "I'm a licensed private investigator. I've been building a file on Mrs. Mitchell for 6 months. I've got footage of her destroying property on this lawn 24 times. I've got her on thermal cameras entering backyard fences at 3:00 a.m. And I've got the footage from 30 seconds ago." The officer looked at the screen. I watched his face. He watched the video of Cassandra walking onto my lawn with the pink cricket bat. He watched her swing with the intent to destroy, and he watched the accident happen. "She swung a weapon at a stationary object on private property," Marcus said, his voice dropping into a professional monotone. "The object responded to the force of her strike. In legal terms, officer, that's not an assault. That's a self-inflicted injury sustained during the commission of a felony, property destruction and trespassing." Cassandra let out a choked sound of protest, but the paramedics were already rolling the stretcher onto the grass. As they lifted her, the pink cricket bat was visible in the gutter, a piece of evidence that couldn't be explained away. But Marcus wasn't done. He opened the leather folder. "While you're here, officer, you might want to look at these bank statements. As a resident, I exercised my right to audit the HOA records. It seems our president hasn't just been smashing gnomes. She's been allocating community funds into a private offshore account. $32,000 to be exact." The silence that followed was absolute. The neighbors, the people Cassandra had bullied, fined, and silenced, began to move closer. "She tried to sue me for my daughter's wheelchair ramp," shouted Mr. Henderson. "She told me I'd be evicted if I didn't cut my roses," Mrs. Kim cried out, her voice trembling with months of repressed rage. Officer Ramirez looked at the bleeding woman being loaded into the ambulance, then at the thick file of evidence in Marcus's hand, and finally at me. He looked at the gnome, still standing tall in the mulch with its chipped red hat. "Mr. Miller," Ramirez said, and for a split second I thought I saw the corner of his mouth twitch. "I'm going to need you to come down to the station to give a formal statement. But as for Mrs. Mitchell, I think she's going to be busy with a very different kind of board meeting." As the ambulance sped away, its sirens fading into the distance, I looked at Marcus. "You had all of that? The embezzlement, the footage?" Marcus nodded, a grim smile on his face. I needed her to go too far, Jackson. I needed her to create a scene so loud the police couldn't ignore it. You gave me that scene. You built the one gnome she couldn't break. The sun was finally over the horizon now, bathing Oak Creek in a golden light. For the first time in half a year, the air didn't feel heavy. It felt like home. By noon that day, the mist had cleared from Oak Creek, but the atmosphere in my living room was thick with a different kind of fog. My wife, Elena, was sitting on the sofa, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. Being a paralegal, she knew exactly how the gears of the system turned. She wasn't just worried about the gnome. She was worried about the man who lived in the house of glass and steel. Jackson, she whispered, her eyes fixed on the front door. You're lucky I know every loophole in the civil code, but we're up against Julian Mitchell. That man doesn't just practice law, he manufactures reality. If he wants you in a jumpsuit for what happened this morning, he has the resources to make it happen. As if summoned by her words, my phone began to vibrate on the coffee table. An unknown number, a local area code. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I answered. Mr. Miller, this is Julian Mitchell, Cassandra's husband. The voice was not what I expected. I expected a roar, a threat, the booming arrogance of a corporate shark. Instead, Julian sounded hollow. He sounded like a man who had been carrying a mountain on his back for 20 years and had finally felt the first tremor of an earthquake. I'm calling from the hospital, Julian continued, his voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial murmur. Cassandra is in surgery. The doctors are talking about permanent nerve damage and reconstructive hardware for her jaw. She's already demanding your head on a silver platter. She wants me to sue you into the Stone Age. I felt a cold sweat prickle my neck. She trespassed, Julian. She was swinging a weapon on my property. I know, he interrupted, his voice cracking. I've seen the videos Marcus sent over. I've seen the 4 years of abuse she's put this neighborhood through. Jackson, I'm not calling to threaten you. I'm calling to offer a deal. He took a long, shaky breath. I've been cleaning up Cassandra's messes since our honeymoon. The settlements in Connecticut, the non-disclosure agreements in Riverside. I've spent millions of dollars and thousands of hours protecting a woman who doesn't even like me. I'm done. I want out. The deal was breathtaking in its simplicity. Julian would use his connections to ensure the police investigation into the Gnome accident was classified as an unfortunate case of provoked negligence. He would make sure no criminal charges were filed against me for the trap. In exchange, he needed the neighbors to stand down. Tell Marcus to bury the embezzlement files, Julian said. Tell the Hendersons and Mrs. Kim to drop their harassment complaints. If the neighborhood goes quiet, I can make this all disappear. We will sell the house. We will move across the country. I'll give her the divorce papers once she's out of the hospital, and you'll never see a Mitchell in Oak Creek again. For a second, I was tempted. The easy way out. No court dates, no lawyers, no risk of a felony record, just peace. I have to talk to the neighbors, Julian, I said. I called Marcus immediately. I told him the offer. I expected him to be relieved, but there was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. Jackson, Marcus finally said, his voice hard. If we take this deal, she wins again. She'll move to a new town, she'll find a new HOA, and she'll find a new Jackson to torture. She never learns because she never pays. She thinks her husband's money and power are a shield that makes her immortal. He paused, and I could hear him shuffling papers. I did a deeper dive into those HOA records, Jackson. It's not just $30,000. She's been steering contracts to her brother's landscaping company for 3 years. It's systematic racketeering. If we let her walk, we're just as guilty as Julian is. I looked out my window at the spot where the gnome had stood. I thought about the 23 ceramic soldiers who had fallen so I could reach this moment. I thought about the fear in the neighborhood. I called Julian back. No deal, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I'm not stopping the neighbors, and if the police want to charge me, I'll see them in court. But your wife isn't walking away from this one. The kingdom of glass is coming down. There was a long silence on the other end. Then Julian spoke so softly I almost missed it. "I understand. Good luck, Jackson. You're going to need it." The war wasn't over. It was just moving from the garden to the courtroom. And this time I wasn't just fighting for my gnomes. I was fighting for the soul of the street. The days that followed were a blur of flashing lights and legal jargon. But the morning after my call with Julian was the first time I felt the air in Oak Creek actually reach my lungs. I walked into the police station with my head held high, Elena by my side, and Marcus following close behind with a digital folder that could have sunk a battleship. I gave my statement to Officer Ramirez. I showed the videos, all 24 of them. I explained the pattern, the shattered ceramic, the pink gloves, the middle-of-the-night trespassing. When I got to the part about Project Karma, I didn't lie. I told him exactly how I'd used my engineering background to design a kinetic security measure intended to protect my property from a serial vandal. Ramirez listened, his pen scratching against his notepad. When I finished, he looked up and gave me a nod that said more than words ever could. "Mr. Miller," he said, "you didn't start this war, you just provided the equipment for her to end it herself." The legal fallout was a landslide. Cassandra's attempt to sue me for intentional battery was laughed out of the preliminary hearing. The judge, a no-nonsense woman who had clearly dealt with HOA tyrants before, ruled the incident as provoked negligence. The evidence was simply too overwhelming. Cassandra had trespassed with a weapon, and my gnome hadn't moved an inch to find her. She had sought out the impact. The laws of physics had simply obliged. But while my legal troubles vanished, Cassandra's were just beginning. With the embezzlement records Marcus provided, the district attorney didn't just walk, they ran. Cassandra was hit with felony property destruction, harassment, trespassing, and the big one, felony embezzlement of HOA funds. The HOA board, finally freed from her shadow, voted to remove her and strip her of her membership within 48 hours. Julian Mitchell, true to his word of being done, didn't fight it. He settled the restitution for every single one of my 23 destroyed gnomes, paid back every cent stolen from the community fund, and filed for divorce the same day Cassandra was cleared for a liquid-only diet. A month later, a "for sale" sign appeared on the lawn of the glass and steel monstrosity. It didn't stay up long. I stood on my porch this morning holding a fresh cup of coffee. The sun was warm on my face. Across the street, the Henderson kids were riding their bikes, laughing loudly, a sound that used to be a finable offense in this neighborhood. Mrs. Kim was out in her yard, planting a vibrant bed of tulips, no longer worried about aesthetic continuity. Marcus walked over, leaning against my porch railing. "You know," he said, looking at the empty spot in my garden, "people are asking when the blue coat soldier is coming back." I smiled. "He served his purpose, Marcus. The war is over." I looked down at my garden. It was peaceful. It was mine. For 6 months, I lived in a state of constant, low-grade fear, wondering if I should just pack up and let a bully take my home. Instead, I stayed. I built something. I stood my ground. Sometimes the world doesn't need a hero. Sometimes it just needs a guy with a garage, a high-tension spring, and the courage to say enough. Oak Creek Estates finally feels like a community again. And as for Cassandra, I hear she's living in a gated apartment complex now. I hope for her sake they don't allow garden decorations, because some lessons are learned the hard way, one ceramic hat at a time. This story is a reminder that you don't have to let bullies run your life. If you enjoyed seeing a Karen finally meet her match, make sure to smash that like button and subscribe for more tales of suburban justice. Have you ever stood up to someone who thought they were untouchable? Drop your story in the comments below. I want to hear how you won your war. And if you want to see the blueprints for the gnome that started it all, well, you'll just have to stay tuned for the next episode. Thanks for watching.